The lake house windows reflected the sunset as my mother raised her glass, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "To family," she announced, her voice dripping with the practiced warmth she reserved for these occasions. "And to this special place that will always be for our real family only." Her eyes slid to me as she emphasized real, a subtle dig that everyone at the table understood. My sister Melissa smiled, leaning into her husband James with the casual confidence of someone who has never questioned her place. My father nodded approvingly, his attention already drifting to his phone where stock prices demanded more of his interest than his younger daughter ever did. I took a small sip of my wine and said nothing. They had no idea that the deed to this lakefront property had my signature on it. Emily Chen, the family disappointment, not theirs. The property they'd been using for decades, the one my mother had just declared was for real family only, had belonged to me for exactly 27 days. And watching them now, I realized I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. I felt something else entirely. Something that had been growing inside me for years, quiet and powerful. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was recognition. Not just from them, but from myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Part 1. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though it's hard to pinpoint exactly when I became the family afterthought. Maybe it was when Melissa skipped 2 grades and became the Chen family prodigy. Maybe it was when I chose art classes over math team. Or maybe it was simply that I was born with a quieter spirit in a family that rewarded those who demanded attention. My earliest memory of understanding my place was at 7 years old. I'd spent weeks creating a detailed model of the solar system for the science fair. My planets were perfectly proportioned, hand-painted with careful attention to their unique features. I'd even added tiny spacecraft near the planets humans had visited. Mrs. Wilson, my science teacher, had called it exceptional. When I brought it home, my father glanced up from his newspaper and said, "That's nice, Emily," before returning to the business section. My mother was busy helping Melissa prepare for a debate competition. My solar system sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before disappearing. I later found it in the recycling bin, Jupiter and Saturn cracked beyond repair. That same week, Melissa won her debate. My parents took her out for dinner at the oceanfront, Seattle's most expensive restaurant. I stayed with Mrs. Winters next door, who made me macaroni and cheese and told me I had a creative mind. "Some people won't understand that," she said, "but it's a gift." By high school, the pattern was firmly established. Melissa was accepted to Princeton early decision. I was accepted to the University of Washington with a partial scholarship for design. My acceptance letter was acknowledged with nods. We celebrated. Melissa's with a catered party for 50 people in our Queen Anne mansion. "Not everyone can be exceptional," my mother said when I asked if we might go out to dinner for my acceptance too. "But the state school will be perfect for you, Emily. Lower pressure." I learned to find my worth elsewhere. I poured myself into my studies, discovering a passion for architecture and urban planning. I made friends who valued my quieter insights. I found joy in creating spaces that made people feel both comforted and inspired. And I stopped bringing my achievements home. The summer after my sophomore year of college, my parents bought the lake house on Lake Washington. It was a stunning property. 4 bedrooms, private dock, wall-to-wall windows capturing the water and mountain views. It had belonged to a tech executive who'd lost heavily in a market downturn. My father boasted about the steal he'd negotiated, while the former owner was desperate. "This is where the Chen family legacy begins," my mother declared the first weekend they hosted friends there. "A place for generations of Chens to gather." I noticed she said this while Melissa was present, but I was in Seattle, working 2 summer jobs. I wasn't invited to the lake house inauguration. When I asked about visiting, my mother sighed. Maybe when you're not so busy with those little jobs of yours. This is meant to be a relaxing retreat. After college, Melissa went to Harvard Business School, then landed a marketing executive position at one of Seattle's fastest-growing tech companies. I took a junior design position at an architecture firm, living in a small but sunny apartment in Capitol Hill. My starting salary barely covered rent and student loan payments, but I loved the work and the neighborhood's creative energy. Family gatherings became increasingly difficult. The questions were always the same. Still at that little design company, Emily? When are you going to find a nice man like James? Wouldn't you be happier in a corporate position? I'm sure Melissa could put in a word. I became an expert at deflection, at small smiles and vague answers. I became proficient at being forgettable. Sometimes I thought it was better that way. Their disappointment was easier to bear than their scrutiny. The lake house became the symbol of everything I couldn't access. It hosted Melissa's engagement party, her baby shower, countless holiday gatherings. Invitations to these events arrived late, as afterthoughts. "We weren't sure you could get away from work," my mother would say when I questioned the delay. I was 26 when everything changed. Not in a dramatic moment, but in a series of small realizations that built like waves, finally powerful enough to shift the shore of my life. It began with a layoff. The architecture firm lost a major client and cut half their junior staff. I was devastated, not just financially, but because I'd poured my heart into projects that would now be reassigned. That weekend, still reeling, I attended a mandatory family dinner. "Maybe this is a sign," my mother said when I shared the news. "You could take some business classes, get a real career started." My father barely looked up from his phone. Design is a hobby, not a profession, unless you're at the very top. And let's be realistic about your prospects. Melissa, 7, months pregnant with her second child, reached across the table to pat my hand. "My company has an opening in the administrative department. I could refer you." I remember looking at them, these people who shared my blood but had never seen me, and feeling something settle inside me. Not anger, clarity. "Thank you," I said, "but I have some savings. I'm going to take a little time to figure out my next steps." What I didn't tell them was that over the past 4 years, I hadn't just been designing office buildings and retail spaces. I'd been studying real estate markets, property investment, and urban development trends. I'd been setting aside every spare dollar, living well below my means. And I'd been quietly making connections with investors who valued my eye for properties with untapped potential. 2 months after the layoff, I found an investor willing to back my first solo project, renovating a neglected fourplex in an up-and-coming neighborhood. I used my design skills to maximize the spaces, my understanding of urban planning to anticipate the area's growth, and my empathy to create homes people would love, not just tolerate. We sold the building for 47% above our investment. My cut wasn't huge, but it was enough to fund my next project without outside investors. I registered my company, Perspective Properties, that same week. For the next 3 years, I lived a double life. To my family, I was Emily, who had found some freelance design work and was getting by. I arrived at family functions in simple clothes, drove my reliable but aging Honda, and continued to deflect questions about my career with practiced vagueness. Meanwhile, Perspective Properties grew from renovating small multifamily buildings to developing mixed-use spaces that revitalized overlooked neighborhoods. I built a small but exceptional team who shared my vision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My bank account grew, but more importantly, so did my confidence. I never lied to my family. I simply stopped offering information they never really wanted. When my mother called, which was rare, she spent 20 minutes talking about Melissa's children, or my father's golf game before asking, "And how are you?" in a tone that suggested the answer should be brief. "I'm doing well," I would say. "Work is busy." "That's nice, dear," she would reply, already mentally moving on to more important matters. I bought my first truly significant property on my 30th birthday, a historic building in Pioneer Square that most developers considered too risky to touch. My team and I transformed it into a thriving community space with affordable apartments above and small business incubators below. The mayor attended the ribbon cutting. My picture was in the Seattle Times business section. My mother called that weekend. "We're having a small gathering at the lake house next Saturday. Melissa's gotten another promotion. Try to wear something nice, Emily. The Harrisons will be there." I almost declined. These gatherings had become increasingly painful, the contrast between my hidden success and their perception of me more difficult to reconcile. But something made me say yes. Perhaps it was knowing that things were about to change in ways none of us could anticipate. What my family didn't know was that the lake house, their precious retreat, the symbol of the Chen family success, had quietly gone on the market 3 months earlier. My father's business had been struggling for years, though he hid it well. The pandemic had dealt the final blow to his chain of luxury retail stores. They were liquidating assets, starting with the lake house. I learned this through industry connections, not family confidence. The property was being sold discreetly to avoid rumors about the Chen family's financial situation. The asking price was steep but fair given the market's recovery. I could have confronted them. I could have offered help. But decades of dismissal had taught me they would never accept either from me. So instead, I made an offer through a holding company. It was accepted within days. And so, 1 month before that family gathering, I became the owner of the lake house that had never truly welcomed me. No one knew except my lawyer and my closest friend Zoe, who had witnessed too many years of my family's casual cruelty. "What are you going to do?" Zoe asked when I told her. "Tell them immediately? Wait until they try to sell it to someone else?" I considered her question carefully. "Neither," I finally said. "I'm going to wait for the right moment, not for revenge, for recognition." The family gathering to celebrate Melissa's promotion was like countless others before it. My mother fussed over the perfect placement of flowers and canapes. My father talked business with James and his golf buddies. Melissa held court in the living room, describing her new leadership role with practiced humility that still managed to emphasize her importance. I wore a simple black dress, nothing that would draw attention. I brought a bottle of wine that was nice but not impressive. I complimented the house as I always did, noting the new artwork my mother had added to the entryway. "A limited edition print," she informed me. "They're very exclusive. The artist only sells to certain collectors." I nodded appreciatively, not mentioning that I owned 2 original pieces by the same artist, or that she had designed the community art space in my Pioneer Square building. The dinner proceeded with familiar rhythms. Conversation focused on Melissa's achievements, my father's golf game, and the accomplishments of my niece and nephew. I was asked exactly 3 questions. If I was still in the same apartment, if I had met anyone special, and if I had found steady work yet. "Still designing," I said to the last question. "It's going well." My mother's smile was polite but dismissive. "That's nice, dear." It was after dinner, when everyone moved to the deck to enjoy the sunset over the lake, that my mother made her toast. Standing before the stunning view, glass raised, she spoke about family legacy and belonging. And then she said those words, eyes sliding meaningfully to me. "To this special place that will always be for our real family only." The implication was clear. Real family contributed. Real family achieved. Real family belonged in spaces like this. I was merely tolerated, a technical relation rather than a true member of their circle. In previous years, I would have felt a familiar ache, that childhood longing for acceptance that never quite fades. But this time, something different bloomed inside me. Not anger, not hurt. Something like peace. I stepped forward, glass in hand. This was not planned. I had intended to wait, perhaps for months, before revealing the truth. But in that moment, watching the sunset reflect off the lake my property taxes now paid to access, I couldn't maintain the charade. "It's a beautiful house," I said quietly. Everyone turned, surprise on their faces. I rarely spoke up at these gatherings. "I've always thought so, from the first time I saw the listing photos." My mother's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, Emily?" "The original listing, from when you and Dad bought it. And then again, more recently, when it went back on the market." The deck fell silent. My father's face paled slightly. Melissa and James exchanged confused glances. "I don't know what you're talking about," my mother said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. I set my glass down gently on the railing. The property was listed 3 months ago. Quietly, but listings can never be completely private in real estate. Not if you know where to look. My father stepped forward now, his expression a mix of anger and alarm. "Emily, that's enough. You're making a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Dad. I'm making an announcement." I turned to face the entire group. "I bought the lake house last month. The deed transferred 3 weeks ago. The company that purchased it, Perspective Properties, that's my company. I founded it 4 years ago." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to pause their evening songs. "That's not possible," my mother finally said. "You can barely make rent on that apartment." I smiled, not unkindly. "I've owned my building for 2 years now. The apartment was a convenient fiction. Like so many things between us." "You're lying," Melissa said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded document, a copy of the deed with my name clearly visible. I placed it on the outdoor table. "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. "I'm not doing this for revenge. I bought this house because it was a sound investment, and because I couldn't bear to see it go to strangers." My father picked up the document with trembling hands. His face went through a remarkable series of transformations: disbelief, shock, and finally, something that looked almost like shame. "How?" he asked, his voice barely audible. So I told them. About Perspective Properties, about the buildings I'd transformed, about the team I'd built and the communities we'd helped revitalize. I told them about the Mayor's Award for Urban Innovation I'd received last year, about the profile in architecture today, about the 7-figure bank account that had made the lake house purchase possible. I didn't speak with anger or triumph. I spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed their approval to know her worth. When I finished, my mother sat heavily in one of the deck chairs. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, and for the first time in my memory, her voice held no judgment, only genuine confusion. "Because you never asked," I said simply. "Not really. You asked if I was still designing, the way someone asks if a child is still playing with blocks. You never wanted to know what I was building." My words hung in the evening air. In the silence that followed, I could almost hear the reshuffling of perceptions, the mental recalibrations happening around me. "So, what happens now?" James finally asked, ever the pragmatist. "Are you evicting us?" I laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to break some of the tension. "No. This house has always been for family. I meant what I said. I couldn't bear to see it go to strangers. It stays in the family. The difference is, now I get to decide what real family means." I looked at my mother as I said this last part. Her eyes met mine, and for what might have been the first time, she truly saw me. "So," I continued, picking up my wine glass again, "to family. The ones who see us as we are, not as they wish us to be. The ones who make space for our dreams, even when they don't understand them. The ones who know that belonging isn't earned through achievement, but given freely through love. I raised my glass, and after a moment's hesitation, they raised theirs too. The sun had nearly disappeared beyond the mountains now, casting long shadows across the deck. In that golden light, I saw my family not as the giants who had loomed over my childhood, but as people, flawed, complex, and capable of change. Would things be different now? I didn't know. 30 years of family dynamics don't transform in a single evening. But as I stood there, owner of the house that had once symbolized my exclusion, I felt the first tentative bridge being built across the gulf that had separated us for so long. And that, more than any property deed, felt like coming home. The morning after my revelation at the lake house, I woke in the guest bedroom feeling oddly light. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting patterns on the hardwood floor I now technically owned. I lay there for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of activity downstairs. Muted voices, the clatter of dishes, life continuing despite the seismic shift that had occurred. I hadn't planned to stay the night. After my announcement and the stunned silence that followed, I'd intended to drive back to Seattle, to my actual home with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the panoramic view of the city I'd earned. But my mother, in an unprecedented move, had asked me to stay. Not with the dismissive assumption that I had nowhere better to be, but with a tentative, almost vulnerable request that suggested she wanted time to understand, perhaps. Even time to know me. So I'd agreed, retreating to this guest room that had always been assigned to me during family gatherings. I'd never personalized it the way Melissa had been encouraged to decorate her room here. No photographs on the dresser, no favorite books on the nightstand. It had remained as impersonal as a hotel room, fitting, I supposed, for someone who had always felt like a visitor in her own family. I showered and dressed in yesterday's clothes, wondering what awaited me downstairs. Would there be anger, now that the shock had worn off? Accusations? Perhaps worst of all, would there be a return to the familiar patterns, my revelation dismissed as luck or minimized until it fit their comfortable narrative about me? The kitchen fell quiet as I entered. My mother stood by the coffee maker, her normally perfect appearance slightly softened by what appeared to be a restless night. My father sat at the island, newspaper open but unread before him. They both looked up, their expressions a complex mix of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady despite the uncertainty churning inside me. "Emily." My father nodded, then gestured to the empty stool beside him. "Coffee?" I sat, accepting the mug my mother silently offered. The coffee was prepared exactly as I liked it, a splash of almond milk, no sugar. Had she always known my preference, or was this a new observation, part of seeing me with fresh eyes? "We should talk," my father said finally, folding his newspaper. With deliberate precision. "About the house. About your company." "Yes," I agreed, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "We should." "Why didn't you tell us?" My mother's question came out sharper than perhaps she intended, her composure fraying at the edges. "All these years, Emily? All these family dinners, and you never once mentioned building a real estate company?" I considered her question carefully, not wanting to respond from old wounds or lingering resentment. "Would you have believed me?" I asked finally. "Or would you have worried I was overextending myself, taking on something beyond my capabilities?" My mother's reflexive denial died on her lips. We both knew the truth. Every independent choice I'd made had been met with concern rather than confidence, warnings rather than encouragement. "We've always wanted what was best for you," my father said, his businessman's voice softening slightly. "We worried about you. The design field is so competitive, so unstable." "I know," I said, and I meant it. But worrying about someone isn't the same as believing in them. I took a careful sip of coffee. You never asked me about my dreams. You asked if I was, stable, if I was getting by. There's a difference. My mother sank onto the stool across from me, her manicured fingers clasping and unclasping. When did you start the company? How did you... real estate requires capital, connections. I started 4 years ago after the architecture. Firm downsized. Remember when you suggested I take an administrative job at Melissa's company? She nodded, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. I had already been studying the market for years by then. Working at the firm gave me insights into property development, construction costs, zoning regulations. I'd been saving everything I could. I found an investor who believed in my vision for my first project. And after that, I shrugged. Each success funded the next one. And now you own a company worth... My father let the question hang. Enough to purchase this house in cash and still maintain a healthy portfolio of investments. I wouldn't give him exact figures. Some boundaries were still necessary. Perspective Properties focuses on revitalizing overlooked spaces, creating housing and commercial developments that serve communities rather than just turning profits. Like that project in Pioneer Square, my mother said quietly. The one that was in the paper last year, with the mayor. Surprise flickered through me. You saw that? Of course we saw it, she said, something like hurt crossing her features. Emily Chen, innovative developer. We thought it must be someone with the same name. The irony struck me then, that they had seen evidence of my success, but found it more plausible that another Emily Chen existed than to believe their daughter capable of such achievement. Why the lake house? My father asked, returning to the most pressing question. You could have approached us directly if you knew we needed to sell. I set my mug down carefully. Would you have sold it to me? Or would you have refused, insisting you were fine, that everything was under control? I met his gaze directly. Would you have accepted financial help from your struggling younger daughter? His silence was answer enough. I didn't buy it to embarrass you, I continued more gently. I bought it because it matters to our family. Because despite everything, I have memories here too. And yes, I admitted. Part of me wanted you to finally see me, really see me, for who I am and what I've built. My mother's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I don't know who you are, she whispered. My own daughter, and I don't know you at all. The raw honesty in her voice struck me more powerfully than any dismissal ever had. For the first time, she wasn't pretending to understand me or projecting her expectations onto me. She was acknowledging the distance between us, a necessary first step to potentially bridging it. I'd like to change that, I said quietly, if you're willing. A tentative nod was her only response, but it was enough for now. My father cleared his throat, retreating to more familiar territory. We should discuss the practical matters. The ownership transfer, our continued use of the property. Nothing has to change immediately, I interrupted. The house remains available to the family just as before. We can work out a formal arrangement later if necessary. I paused, then added, I don't need your money, if that's what concerns you. He looked slightly taken aback, perhaps unaccustomed, to having financial discussions where he wasn't in the position of power. That's generous of you, Emily. It's not about generosity, I corrected gently. It's about family. Isn't that what this place was always supposed to represent? Before either could respond, the sound of a car pulling up outside broke our fragile moment of understanding. Moments later, Melissa burst through the front door, James trailing behind, her with an apologetic expression. Is it true? She demanded, striding into the kitchen with the confident energy that had always been her signature. Dad, Is what Emily said last night actually true? My father glanced at me, then back to Melissa. Yes, the lake house now belongs to your sister. Melissa stared at him, then at me, her expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked almost like betrayal. How is that possible? How could this happen without any of us knowing? Your sister has built a successful real estate company, my mother said, her voice carrying a strange new note. Was it pride? Apparently, she's quite accomplished. Melissa blinked rapidly, processing this information. But you still live in that tiny apartment in Capitol Hill? You wear the same clothes for years. You drive a 2012 Honda. I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. I value simplicity and privacy. The apartment is actually a 3-story townhouse now. I renovated the building 2 years ago. The Honda is reliable, and I don't need a luxury car to validate my success. All this time, Melissa shook her head, sinking onto a bar stool. All those family dinners where we talked about my promotions, my projects. Why didn't you say anything? The question echoed my mother's earlier one, but coming from Melissa, it carried different weight. My sister and I had never been close, separated not just by our different temperaments, but by our parents' comparative treatment of us. I had resented her golden child status, while she had likely never questioned it or considered how it affected me. Would you have wanted to hear it? I asked honestly. Our family dynamics were pretty firmly established. I was the quiet one, the creative one, the one who needed guidance and looking after. You were the success story. That's not fair, Melissa protested, but her objection lacked conviction. I never asked for that role. You didn't have to, I said, not unkindly. It was given to you, just like the role of underachiever was assigned to me. James, who had been silently observing from the kitchen doorway, finally spoke. I've seen your Pioneer Square project, he said, his investment banker's mind evidently having made connections. Mine hadn't. The mixed-use development with the green roof and community spaces, that's yours? I nodded. Impressive work, he said with genuine admiration. That property was considered untouchable by most developers. Too many structural issues, too many zoning complications. The complications were part of the appeal, I admitted. I like solving problems other people avoid. James gave a thoughtful nod. That explains a lot. What happens now? Melissa asked, addressing the same question her husband had posed the night before. With the house? With everything? I looked around the kitchen, taking in the space that held so many complex memories. Now we decide what kind of family we want to be going forward. The kind that measures worth by job titles and possessions, or the kind that values each member for who they truly are. My words hung in the air, challenging and hopeful all at once. I should get back to the city, I said, rising from my stool. I have meetings this afternoon. Will you come to dinner next Sunday? My mother asked suddenly. Here at the lake house, just the family. She paused, then added, please. The please was new. A small acknowledgement that my presence was requested, not assumed, valued, not merely tolerated. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. As I gathered my things to leave, my father followed me to the front door. He stood awkwardly for a moment, a man unaccustomed to uncertainty. Your company, he finally said. Perspective Properties. It's a good name. Thank you, I replied, unexpectedly touched by this small recognition. I'd like to hear more about it. Your projects, your vision. He hesitated, then added, if you're willing to share that with me. I studied his face, searching for the dismissive father who had never believed design could be more than a hobby. Instead, I found an aging man coming to terms with how thoroughly he had misread his own. Daughter, I'd like that, I said again, softer this time. The drive back to Seattle gave me time to process the seismic shift in my family's perception of me. For so long, I had lived with the weight of their underestimation, letting it fuel my determination, while simultaneously carrying the hurt of their dismissal. Now that weight had been lifted, but in its absence, I felt strangely unmoored. Who was I when not defined by their misconceptions? Who would Emily Chen become now that her secret success was revealed? My phone rang as I crossed the 520 bridge, Seattle's skyline emerging through the mist ahead. Zoe's name flashed on the screen. "So," she demanded when I answered, "how did it go? Did you tell them? Are they completely freaking out?" It was. I searched for the right words. Complicated, revealing, maybe the beginning of something new. "Details, Em. I need details." I laughed, the tension of the morning finally breaking. "Come over tonight. Bring wine. I'll tell you everything." "I'll be there at 7 with the good Cabernet," she promised, "the one we save for major life events." "This qualifies," I agreed. My townhouse welcomed me with its familiar comfort, the space I had designed for myself, reflecting my true tastes and priorities, rather than anyone else's expectations. I moved through the rooms, touching surfaces, reorienting myself in the life I had built away from my family's shadow. In my home office, I paused before the vision board that had guided prospective properties from concept to reality. Photos of neglected buildings transformed into vibrant spaces, notes on community needs, sustainability goals, profit projections that had proven conservative in hindsight. In the center, a quote I had calligraphed myself: "Build not what is expected, but what is needed." I had lived by those words professionally. Perhaps now it was time to apply them to rebuilding my family relationships as well. My afternoon meetings went smoothly. A check-in with the construction team on our Belltown project, a video call with potential investors for the affordable housing initiative we were planning in the Central District. I moved through these interactions with the quiet confidence that had become my professional signature, even as my mind occasionally drifted back to the morning's conversations at the lake house. At 7, Zoe arrived with the promised wine and an extra bag from our favorite Thai restaurant. "I figured you wouldn't have eaten," she said, knowing me too well. She set everything on the kitchen counter and fixed me with her therapist's gaze. "You look different." "Different how?" I asked, retrieving wine glasses from the cabinet. "Lighter somehow. Like you've set down something heavy you've been carrying for years." She uncorked the wine with practiced ease. "So tell me everything. Spare no details." Over green curry and Cabernet, I recounted the previous evening's revelation and the morning's aftermath. Zoe listened intently, asking clarifying questions but mostly letting me process aloud. "So, they had no idea?" she asked when I described my parents' shock. "Not even suspicions?" "They saw my name in that newspaper article about the Pioneer Square project and assumed it was someone else," I said, still marveling at the depth of their misconception. That's how firmly they believed in their version of me. "And now?" I traced the rim of my wine glass, considering. "Now they're recalibrating, asking questions they should have asked years ago. It's disorienting for all of us." "Are you going to forgive them?" The question was direct, as Zoe's questions tended to be. "I'm not sure forgiveness is exactly what's needed," I said. Slowly. "They didn't set out to hurt me. They thought they were protecting me from failure by steering me toward what they considered safer paths. They didn't see how their protection became a cage." "That's very generous of you," Zoe noted. "Not generous. Realistic." I took a thoughtful sip of wine. I didn't build prospective properties to prove them wrong or to eventually throw my success in their faces. I built it because it was what I was meant to do, what fulfilled me and allowed me to create positive change. "And buying the lake house?" Zoe raised an eyebrow. "Was that also not about proving anything?" I laughed softly, acknowledging the gentle challenge. Okay, that was partially about finally being seen, about changing the dynamic, but not in a vindictive way. Of course not, Zoe agreed with a knowing smile. You're far too evolved for petty revenge, but a little poetic justice never hurt anyone. We finished the bottle of wine as the conversation shifted to Zoe's work, her recent dating adventures, and our shared plans to explore a potential project, combining her therapy practice with one of my residential developments. By the time she left, the emotional intensity of the past 24 hours had settled into something more manageable, contextualized by the normal rhythms of friendship and everyday concerns. The week passed in a blur of meetings, site visits, and the usual demands of running a growing company. I found myself sharing more with my team than I had before, small personal details I'd previously kept separate from my professional life, as though the compartmentalization had been necessary to maintain the different versions of myself. Sunday arrived with surprising swiftness. I stood in my closet, contemplating what to wear to the lake house dinner. Previously, I'd deliberately downplayed my appearance at family gatherings, choosing unremarkable clothing that reinforced their perception of me struggling to get by. Now, the costume felt unnecessary, even dishonest. I selected a simple but beautifully tailored shirt dress in deep blue, a piece I'd normally reserve for important investor meetings. I added my grandmother's jade pendant, a family heirloom my mother had given me years ago, perhaps the only acknowledgement that I too was part of the Chen legacy. The drive to the lake house felt different this time. I wasn't rehearsing defenses against subtle digs or preparing to deflect uncomfortable questions. I was simply going to dinner with my family, a novel concept after so many years of emotional armor. My mother answered the door herself, rather than calling for me to come, in as she typically would. She had taken particular care with her appearance, I noticed, her hair freshly styled, wearing the pearl earrings my father had given her for their 30th anniversary. "Emily," she said, and then, with a slight hesitation that spoke volumes, "Welcome home." Home. The word hung between us, complicated and hopeful. "Thank you," I replied, offering the bottle of wine I'd brought, not the modest selection I would have previously chosen to avoid scrutiny, but a respected vintage from a small winery owned by one of my business associates. "Your father's on the deck," she said, accepting the wine with an appreciative glance at the label. "Melissa and James will be here soon. The children are with James's parents tonight." I nodded, following her through the house that was both deeply familiar and suddenly different now that I viewed it as its owner. Small details caught my attention: a water stain on the ceiling near the kitchen doorway, sliding doors that stuck slightly, the deck railing that would need replacing soon. The caretaker part of my brain was already making notes, calculating improvements that would preserve the property's value and enhance its comfort. My father stood at the edge of the deck, gazing out at the lake. He turned as I approached, his expression softer than usual, almost uncertain. "Emily," he greeted, raising his scotch glass slightly. "Beautiful evening." "It is," I agreed, joining him at the railing. The lake stretched before us, golden in the early evening light, sailboats drifting lazily across its surface. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, an unusual experience with my typically verbose father. He'd always filled spaces with explanations, opinions, directives, rarely allowing room for quiet contemplation. "I've been thinking," he finally said, his voice more tentative than I could ever remember hearing it, "about your company name, Perspective Properties." He turned to look at me directly. "It's about seeing things differently, isn't it? Finding value where others don't look." The insight surprised me. "Yes," I confirmed, "exactly that." He nodded, returning his gaze to the lake. "I've spent my career focusing on the obvious: luxury retail, high-end properties, markets where success was measured in predictable metrics." A small sigh escaped him. "It never occurred to me to look where others weren't looking." Different. Approaches work for different people, I offered, understanding this was as close to an acknowledgement of my business acumen as he could manage right now. Your sister arrived, my mother called from the doorway. Dinner in 15 minutes. Melissa's greeting was uncharacteristically subdued. The competitive edge that usually defined our interactions seemed blunted, replaced by a watchful curiosity. James, by contrast, was more engaged than usual, asking thoughtful questions about my recent projects and sharing insights from his own work in finance. Dinner itself was a study in careful navigation. We ate my mother's perfectly prepared salmon, discussing safe topics, recent films, the changing Seattle weather, a book my father had been reading about maritime history. The usual interrogation about my career was conspicuously absent, as though they were waiting for me to volunteer information rather than demanding it. As we moved to dessert, my mother's signature green tea panna cotta, the conversation finally turned to the elephant in the room. I've been researching your company, Melissa said, setting down her spoon with deliberate precision. Perspective Properties has an impressive portfolio. Your Rainier Valley project won a sustainability award last year. Thank you, I said, genuinely touched that she had taken the time to look into my work. The Rainier project was particularly meaningful. We were able to preserve 3 historic buildings while creating affordable housing and community spaces. The profit margins must be thinner than traditional development, my father noted, his businessman's mind never far from the bottom line. Initially, yes, I acknowledged. But we've found that our approach builds tremendous community goodwill, which translates to fewer vacancies, longer tenancies, and ultimately, stable returns. Not to mention the tax incentives for historic preservation and sustainability features. He nodded thoughtfully. Smart. Very smart. I'd like to see your office sometime, my mother said unexpectedly, if that would be all right. The request startled me, a genuine interest in my work, not just in how it measured against some predefined standard of success. I'd like that, I said, echoing my response from earlier in the week. Those 4 words seemed to be becoming a bridge between us, tentative, but real. As the evening progressed, I felt the subtle shift in our family dynamic solidifying. My opinions were sought rather than tolerated. My experiences were met with questions rather than assumptions. The change wasn't dramatic. Decades of established patterns couldn't dissolve in a single week. But it was perceptible, like the first thaw after a long winter. When it came time to leave, my mother walked me to the door, lingering as though she had more to say. The jade looks beautiful on you, she finally offered, gesturing to my grandmother's pendant. I always thought it suited you better than Melissa. It matches your artist's eye for color. Thank you, I said, touching the smooth stone reflexively. I've always treasured it. She nodded, then reached out hesitantly to adjust the pendant's position, her fingers cool against my collarbone. The gesture was oddly intimate, motherly in a way her interactions with me rarely were. Next week, she said, her hand returning to her side. Would you like to come for lunch? Just the 2 of us? There's a new bistro in Kirkland I've been wanting to try. The invitation hung between us, simple but profound. Not a family obligation, not a performance of maternal duty, but a genuine desire for connection. I'd like that very much, I said, and for the 3rd time that week, I meant it completely. Driving back to Seattle, I watched the lake house recede in my rearview mirror, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. The property was mine now, in legal terms at least. But perhaps ownership wasn't just about names on deeds or financial transactions. Perhaps true ownership came from being seen, being valued, being welcomed not despite who you are, but because of it. By that measure, I was only beginning to take possession of my place in the Chen family, a process that couldn't be completed with signatures and bank transfers, but only through the patient work of rebuilding relationships on more honest foundations. The skyline of Seattle appeared ahead, the lights of my adopted city shimmering like promises. I had built so much here: a company, a reputation, a life independent of family expectations. Now, unexpectedly, I found myself building something else, a bridge back to the people who had known me longest but seen me least clearly. It would take time. There would be missteps and old patterns reasserting themselves. But for the first time, I felt we might be moving towards something genuine, a family defined not by performance or comparison, but by acceptance and understanding. The jade pendant rested cool against my skin, a tangible connection to my heritage, to the grandmother I'd been named for, but barely knew. Emily Chen, who had crossed oceans and built a new life in a strange land. Emily Chen, who had seen potential, where others saw only obstacles. Perhaps I was more a Chen than any of us had realized, just not in the way they had expected me to be. 3 weeks after my revelation at the lake house, life had settled into a new rhythm, one that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. The shocked phone calls from extended family members had gradually subsided. My Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, who had always treated me with the same polite dismissal as the rest of the family, had called 5 times in 2 days. Her messages, evolving from disbelief to thinly veiled investment inquiries. I hadn't returned her calls yet. Some boundaries needed to remain intact. My weekly lunch with my mother had become an unexpected fixture in my calendar. Today marked our 3rd meeting, this time at a small French bistro in downtown Seattle. My choice, not hers. That small shift in dynamic remained significant. For decades, my mother had selected our meeting places, typically upscale venues where she could display her impeccable taste and social standing. Now, she was navigating spaces I chose, environments that reflected my aesthetic rather than hers. I arrived early, securing a corner table with a view of Elliott Bay. The restaurant was a favorite of mine, unpretentious but excellent, with a chef who had trained in Lyon before returning to his native Seattle to open this intimate space. I watched my mother enter, her elegant figure scanning the room with practiced ease. She spotted me and moved toward the table, her hair mess, scarf and tailored blazer marking her as someone of means, even as she navigated the restaurant's more bohemian atmosphere. "Emily," she greeted, leaning down to brush her cheek against mine, another new development. Physical affection had never been my mother's forte, particularly not with me. "This place is charming. I don't believe I've been here before." Chef Marcel trained at Paul Bocuse's Institute, I explained as she settled into her chair. "His seafood dishes are extraordinary." She raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "You know about Paul Bocuse? I wouldn't have thought." She caught herself, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "I mean, I didn't realize you followed culinary developments." "There's a lot we don't know about each other," I said, keeping my tone light rather than accusatory. "I've always appreciated good food. One of my first projects included a restaurant space. I learned a lot about commercial kitchen design and, by extension, about the culinary world." My mother nodded, unfolding her napkin with characteristic precision. "That makes sense. Your father and I attended a charity dinner last month where Chef Marcel catered. The bouillabaisse was exceptional. Small talk, safe territory. We ordered, she chose the salmon. I selected the coq au vin and sipped our water as the initial awkwardness gradually dissipated. "I visited your office yesterday," she said finally, surprising me. "I had an appointment nearby and thought I might just see the building from outside. I didn't go in." "You could have," I offered. "You'd be welcome any time." She traced the rim of her water glass, a gesture I recognized as one of her rare displays of uncertainty. "I wasn't sure. Things between us are still evolving," I supplied. "Yes." A small smile touched her lips. "Evolving is a good word for it." She looked up, meeting my gaze directly. It's an impressive building, Emily. The renovated warehouse with the living wall on the south facade? I nodded, pleased she had recognized my company's headquarters. We converted it 3 years ago. It was my second major project, the one that really established Perspective Properties in the Seattle market. The landscaping is beautiful, she noted. Those Japanese maples must be stunning in autumn. They are, I confirmed, remembering her passion for gardening, one of the few interests she had attempted to share with me during my childhood, though my lack of enthusiasm had eventually led her to focus those efforts on Melissa instead. We worked with a local landscape architect who specializes in native and Asian species that thrive in our climate. I'd like to see inside sometime, she said, the request coming more directly than I had expected. If that would be appropriate. Of course. I felt a strange tightness in my chest, not unpleasant but intense. For decades, I had craved my mother's interest in my life, my work, my passions. Now that it was finally happening, the reality felt almost too potent, like looking directly at the sun after years in shadow. We could schedule a tour next week if you'd like. Our food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. I watched. My mother take her first bite, noting her appreciative nod. Small victories. Your father and I have been talking, she said after several minutes of comfortable silence. About the lake house situation. Oh? I kept my tone neutral, though my grip on my fork tightened slightly. Here it was, the real reason for our continued lunches. They wanted to negotiate, to reclaim control of the property that had symbolized their success for so long. He wants to pay you rent, she continued, surprising me again. A formal lease agreement. He says it's the proper way to handle the arrangement, given the circumstances. I set down my fork, considering her words carefully. That isn't necessary, he insists. A hint of the old firmness returned to her voice. Robert feels it's a matter of dignity. He can't accept charity from his daughter. I almost laughed at the irony. How many times had they positioned their minimal support during my college years as generous assistance rather than the basic parental obligation it had been? But I recognized the olive branch beneath my father's proposal. His pride wouldn't allow him to simply accept my generosity, but this arrangement acknowledged my ownership while allowing him to retain some agency. All right, I conceded. A nominal amount then. Enough to establish a formal relationship without being burdensome. Relief softened my mother's features. Thank you, Emily. That's very understanding of you. It's just business, I said, echoing. One of my father's favorite phrases with a small smile. She caught the reference and returned the smile, a moment of genuine connection flickering between us. Speaking of business, she said, her voice taking on a hesitant quality that remained strange to hear from my typically decisive mother. I was hoping to ask your advice about something. My advice? I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. Yes. She folded her hands on the table, fingers interlacing tightly. Your father doesn't know I'm discussing this with you, and I'd prefer to keep it that way for now. Curiosity. Piqued, I nodded my agreement. Our financial situation is more complicated than you might realize, she continued, lowering her voice slightly. The retail business has been struggling for several years. The pandemic was devastating, of course, but even before that, the shift to online shopping had impacted revenues significantly. I knew this already. It was precisely why the lake house had been quietly listed for sale. But I let her continue without interruption. Robert has been exploring options to liquidate assets and restructure the company. The lake house was just the beginning. She paused, taking a careful sip of water. We own several commercial properties in Bellevue that have been part of the Chen portfolio for decades. Your grandfather purchased them in the 70s. I'm familiar with them, I said. The Bellevue properties represented some of the Chen family's earliest real estate investments, prime locations now, but at the time, risky ventures in what had been a developing area. Robert is considering selling them to shore up the retail division. She hesitated, then added, I'm not convinced it's the right move. The retail landscape continues to change so rapidly, and those properties have been reliable income sources for years. I studied her carefully, seeing past the polished exterior to the worry beneath. And you're asking my opinion as a real estate developer? Yes. Her gaze met mine directly. You've built an impressive company in a relatively short time. You clearly understand the market in ways that... She paused, seemingly struggling to find the right words. In ways that surprise you, I finished for her, keeping my tone gentle rather than accusatory. She nodded, a flicker of what might have been shame crossing her features. Yes, and I find myself wondering if perhaps you see opportunities that we've missed. The moment felt pivotal. My mother not just acknowledging my expertise but actively seeking it. The daughter who had never been enough was suddenly being consulted on family matters that had always been considered beyond my comprehension. I'd need to review the property's current financials and the retail company's situation to give you proper advice, I said, professional instincts kicking in. But speaking very generally, this could be an opportunity rather than just a crisis. Commercial real estate is evolving rapidly post-pandemic. Those properties might have potential for mixed-use redevelopment that could generate both immediate capital and long-term income streams. My mother's eyes widened slightly. Mixed use? You mean like your Pioneer Square project? Something similar, though adapted to Bellevue's market and zoning regulations. It would depend on the specific locations and current tenant situations. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. I'd be happy to take a look at the portfolio, if you'd like. Strictly as a consultant, no strings attached. She seemed to consider this, weighing family dynamics against practical needs. Would you be willing to sign a confidentiality agreement? At least until we decide how to approach this with your father? Of course, I agreed, understanding her caution. My father's pride would make this conversation difficult, particularly coming so soon after the lake house revelation. I can have my legal team prepare something appropriate. Your legal team, she echoed, a small, incredulous laugh escaping her. My daughter has a legal team. The wonder in her voice caught me off guard. Is that really so hard to believe? She reached across the table, her manicured fingers briefly touching mine in a rare gesture of physical connection. It's not that, Emily. It's just... She faltered, then continued with uncharacteristic vulnerability. I'm realizing how much of your life I've missed. How little I know about the woman you've become. The admission hung between us, fragile and profound. I felt the weight of decades of misunderstanding, of assumptions and projections that had shaped our relationship. But beneath that weight was something unexpected, a tentative bridge being constructed from both sides. We have time, I said simply, to change that. She nodded, withdrawing her hand and composing herself with visible effort. Yes, I suppose we do. The rest of lunch passed in lighter conversation. Her garden club's upcoming exhibition, a documentary series I'd been watching about urban architecture, neutral territory that allowed us to interact without the freight of our complicated history. When we parted outside the restaurant, her goodbye hug felt less performative than usual, though still cautious. I'll email you the information about the Bellevue properties, she said, adjusting her scarf against the autumn breeze. I'll look forward to it, I replied, surprised to find I meant it. As I walked back to my office, I found myself contemplating the strange turn my life had taken. For years, I had built perspective properties with a singular focus, creating beautiful, functional spaces that served communities while providing financial independence. I had never anticipated that my company would become the vessel through which my family might finally see me clearly. Nor had I expected that the lake house, a symbol of my exclusion for so long, would become the catalyst for genuine connection. The universe, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of humor. My assistant Karen greeted me as I entered the office. The Mitchell Group called about the South Lake Union proposal. They'd like to move up the meeting to tomorrow if possible. And Zoe left a message. She said to tell you she expects full details about lunch with the Dragon Lady. I smiled at Zoe's nickname for my mother, though it felt less appropriate now than it had just weeks ago. Tell the Mitchell Group tomorrow. Works, and I'll call Zoe back this afternoon. Will do. Karen handed me a stack of messages and correspondence. Oh, and there's someone waiting in your office. I tried to schedule a proper appointment, but she insisted on waiting. Said she's family. A flicker of unease ran through me. My mother? Karen shook her head. Your sister, Melissa. She's been here about 20 minutes. Surprise replaced unease. Melissa, here, in my professional domain? This was unprecedented. Thanks for letting me know, I said, gathering my composure as I headed toward my office. I found Melissa standing by the wall of windows, gazing out at the Seattle skyline. She turned as I entered, her expression uncharacteristically uncertain. She was dressed for business in a sleek pantsuit, her designer handbag placed precisely on the edge of my desk. Emily, she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I hope it's okay that I dropped by. Your assistant tried to schedule something, but She trailed off, gesturing vaguely. I was in the neighborhood for a meeting and thought I'd take a chance. It's fine, I assured her, setting down my things and moving toward my desk. Can I offer you coffee? Tea? No, thank you. She remained standing, though I had gestured toward the chairs opposite my desk. This is really impressive, Em. Your office, this building, all of it. Thank you, I said, the compliment feeling strange coming from the sister who had always been positioned as the successful one, the achiever against whom I was constantly measured and found wanting. I've been doing some research, she continued, finally taking a seat. About prospective properties, about your projects, the industry recognition you've received. I waited, unsure where this was heading. Why didn't you tell us? The question emerged abruptly, her composure cracking slightly. All those family dinners, all those holiday gatherings where Mom and Dad fawned over my latest promotion or James's new client. Why did you just sit there and let us believe you were barely getting by? The question echoed those my parents had asked, but coming from Melissa, it carried different weight. She had been my childhood nemesis in many ways. The standard bearer, the golden child, the daughter who fulfilled our parents' expectations while I consistently fell short. Would you have listened? I asked quietly. Or would you have found a way to minimize it, to frame it as lucky timing or a fluke success? Her flinch told me I had struck close to home. That's not fair, she protested, but weakly. Isn't it? I kept my tone even, not accusatory, but firmly rooted in our shared reality. Melissa, from the time we were children, our family had very clearly defined roles. You were the star. I was the also-ran. That narrative shaped everything, how our parents invested in us, how they celebrated our achievements, how they responded to our setbacks. I never asked for that, she said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. I know, I acknowledged. We were both children. Neither of us created the dynamic, but you benefited from it, and I paused, considering. My words carefully. I had to find my own path, away from their expectations and outside of your shadow. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze dropping to her perfectly manicured hands. I've been thinking about this nonstop since the lake house, she finally said. Going over memories, trying to see things from your perspective. It's been uncomfortable. I waited, sensing she had more to say. Do you remember when you won that citywide art competition in 9th grade? She asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said, the memory surfacing with surprising clarity. For the architectural drawing of a sustainable community center. She nodded. Mom and Dad took us all out to dinner afterward. Dad spent the entire meal talking about my debate tournament the following weekend. I remember, I said quietly. The celebratory dinner that hadn't actually celebrated my achievement had been a familiar experience. What you probably don't know, Melissa continued, is that I tried to redirect the conversation back to your award 3 times. I kept saying how impressive your drawing was, how the judges had specifically commented on your innovative use of space. She gave a small, bitter laugh. Each time, Mom or Dad would acknowledge it briefly, then pivot right back to my upcoming debate. Eventually, I stopped trying. I stared at her, this new information reshaping a memory I had long ago filed under typical disappointment. I didn't understand then what was happening, she said. I just knew it felt wrong. But I was 14 and thriving on their approval, so I didn't push harder. She met my gaze directly. I should have. The simple admission hung in the air between us, an unexpected bridge across years of complicated sisterhood. We can't change the past, I said finally. No, she agreed. But maybe we can do better going forward. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folder, placing it carefully on my desk. That's why I'm here, actually. I have a proposition for you. A proposition? I echoed, curiosity piqued. She nodded, professional demeanor reasserting itself. My company is launching a major initiative focused on sustainable urban development. We're partnering with cities across the Pacific Northwest to revitalize underutilized spaces while prioritizing environmental impact and community needs. Sounds intriguing, I said, though I wasn't yet seeing my role in this. We need a real estate development partner, someone who understands both the market realities and the social implications of these projects. She pushed the folder toward me. I want Perspective Properties to be that partner. I picked up the folder but didn't open it immediately. Why us? There are larger firms with more established track records in sustainability. Because no one else approaches development the way you do, she said simply. Your Pioneer Square project proved that profit and purpose can coexist. Your Rainier Valley development demonstrated how to honor a neighborhood's history while creating its future. She paused, then added more quietly, and because you're my sister, and I'd like a chance to work with you as equals, as the colleagues and allies we should have been all along. The proposal was unexpected, not just professionally intriguing, but personally meaningful. Was this Melissa's way of extending an olive branch? Of acknowledging my success not just in words, but through tangible professional respect? I'll need to review the materials, I said, keeping my tone measured despite the emotion threatening to surface, and discuss it with my team. Of course, she agreed quickly. Take all the time you need. The details are in the folder. Projected, budgets, target locations, timeline, everything. My contact information is on the first page. She hesitated, then added, my direct line, not the one that goes through my assistant. Call anytime. Another small symbol of change dynamics, direct access rather than filtered communication. Melissa stood, smoothing her already immaculate suit. I should let you get back to your day. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. You're welcome, I said, rising as well. And Melissa, thank you for the opportunity. Regardless of what happens with the proposal, I appreciate the consideration. She nodded, then surprised me by stepping forward and embracing me briefly. This is long overdue, Em, she whispered before pulling away. All of it. After she left, I remained standing by my desk, the folder unopened before me. Through the glass walls of my office, I could see my team at work. Architects reviewing blueprints, project managers coordinating with contractors, the creative energy that had become the hallmark of Perspective Properties flowing through the open workspace I had carefully designed. I thought about the strange path that had led me here. From the overlooked younger daughter to successful entrepreneur. From family afterthought to potential business partner. The journey had been neither straightforward nor easy. But standing in this office I had created, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where I belonged, who I was meant to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "How was lunch with the dragon lady? Scales still intact?" I smiled, typing back, "Better than expected. She's evolving." Also, Melissa just left my office with a business proposal. The Chen family dynamics are officially in uncharted territory. Zoe's response came quickly. "What?" "Wine. Tonight. My place. Full details required." "Deal," I replied, then set my phone aside and opened the folder Melissa had left. The proposal was impressive, comprehensive, innovative, and aligned with Perspective Properties' core values, in ways that suggested she had done significant research into my company's ethos. The projected partnership would be substantial, potentially doubling our project portfolio over the next 3 years, while expanding our reach throughout the Pacific Northwest. More than the business opportunity, though, I found myself contemplating what this represented on a personal level. My sister, the golden child, the family success story, was approaching me as a peer, recognizing my expertise and seeking my partnership. It was validation of a kind I had never expected. Certainly not from the quarter that had, however unintentionally, contributed to my feelings of inadequacy for so many years. I closed the folder and gazed out at the Seattle skyline, the familiar landscape of cranes and glass towers that had been the backdrop to my professional evolution. Somewhere out there, my mother was perhaps reviewing the real estate portfolio she had promised to share. My father was, in his own way, coming to terms with his younger daughter's unexpected success through the formal lease agreement he had proposed. And now Melissa, extending a business partnership that could reshape both our companies and possibly our relationship. The lake house had been just the beginning. The ripples from that revelation continued to spread outward, transforming family dynamics that had seemed immutable for decades. What had begun as a simple property transaction was becoming something far more profound. A recalibration of perspectives, a reassessment of assumptions long taken for granted. I picked up my phone again and opened my calendar. The coming weeks were already filled with meetings, site visits, and the daily demands of running a growing company. To this, I now added 2 new appointments, one to review my father's properties with my mother, another for a preliminary discussion with my team about Melissa's proposal. The Chen family business was evolving in ways none of us could have predicted. And for the first time, I was not on the periphery but at the center, not the afterthought, but the linchpin. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was the opportunity. This unexpected convergence of personal history and professional present offered possibilities I had never dared contemplate. I wasn't naive enough to believe decades of family patterns could be erased by a few weeks of changed behavior. There would be setbacks, moments when old dynamics reasserted themselves, when ingrained habits proved difficult to break. But something fundamental had shifted. A door had opened that could not easily be closed again. As I turned back to my desk and the day's work awaiting my attention, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. The path forward was uncertain, but for perhaps the first time in my relationship with my family, it held genuine possibility. Not just for tolerance or grudging acceptance, but for connection based on who I truly was rather than who they had always assumed me to be. The lake house that had once symbolized my exclusion now represented something entirely different. The beginning of a new chapter, not just for me, but for all of us. I had bought a property, but what I might have gained was something far more valuable. A family seeing one another clearly, perhaps for the very first time. 6 months had passed since the evening at the lake house when I revealed my ownership of the property. Winter had given way to spring, and Seattle's characteristic drizzle had softened into occasional showers that left the city gleaming. Cherry blossoms lined the streets near my office, their delicate pink petals creating natural confetti on the sidewalks. I sat in my corner office, reviewing the final contracts for what would become Perspective Properties' most ambitious project to date, a 10-acre development on the eastern shore of Lake Washington. The mixed-use complex would include affordable housing units, a community arts center, small business incubator spaces, and green areas designed by an award-winning landscape architect who specialized in sustainable urban environments. What made this project particularly significant wasn't just its scale or innovative design. It was the partnership behind it, a collaboration between my company and Melissa's marketing firm, complete with my father's investment group as a key financial backer. The Chen family, working together professionally for the first time. The journey to this point had been neither straightforward nor simple. After Melissa's unexpected visit to my office with her initial partnership proposal, weeks of negotiations and planning meetings had followed. My father, initially resistant to the idea of his daughters collaborating without his oversight, had eventually been brought into the fold when it became clear that his real estate experience and investor connections could significantly enhance the project's potential. Our professional alliance had catalyzed changes in our personal relationships as well. Gradual, sometimes halting, but unmistakable. My mother had become a regular visitor to my office, her initial discomfort in the EI's modern, open workspace giving way to genuine interest in our design process. My father had begun asking for my input on his own business challenges, particularly regarding the Bellevue properties that my mother had first mentioned during our lunch. Family dinners, once tensely choreographed performances with rigidly defined roles, had evolved into more authentic gatherings. Disagreements still occurred. Decades of entrenched patterns couldn't be undone in a few months, but now they unfolded as honest exchanges between adults rather than controlled expressions of hierarchy. A gentle knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. Karen, my assistant, looked in with an apologetic smile. "Sorry to disturb you, Emily, but your father is here. He says it's important but not urgent. He can wait if you're busy." "No, it's fine," I replied, setting aside the contracts. "Please send him in." My father entered a moment later, his tall figure less imposing than it had once seemed. He wore a casual button-down rather than his usual business suit, another small indicator of the shifting dynamic between us. The formality that had always characterized our interactions was gradually giving way to something more natural. "Emily," he greeted, the subtle warmth in his voice still new enough to notice. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Of course," I said, gesturing to the chairs opposite my desk. "What brings you downtown?" He settled into a chair, his gaze taking in my office with quiet assessment. "I had a breakfast meeting with potential investors for the East Side project. It went well. They're very interested in the sustainable aspects you've incorporated into the design." "That's good news," I said, genuinely pleased. The investors' support would allow us to implement several innovative environmental features that had been on the if budget permits list. "It is," he agreed. "But that's not why I'm here." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Your mother and I have made a decision about the Queen Anne house. My childhood home, the sprawling Queen Anne mansion that had been the backdrop to so many formative memories, both painful and precious. I knew they had been considering downsizing since their financial difficulties had come to light, but they hadn't discussed specific plans with me." "You're selling?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Yes." He sighed, a flicker of genuine regret crossing his features. "It makes sense financially and practically speaking, it's far too large for just the two of us. But that's not why I wanted to speak with you in person." I waited, curious about what warranted this unexpected visit. "We've received an offer," he continued. "Above asking price, minimal contingencies, Flexible closing date. The ideal scenario, really. That's fortunate, I observed, still not seeing why this required a face-to-face conversation. The thing is, he said, meeting my gaze directly, we haven't accepted it yet, because I wanted to speak with you first. Something in his tone made me sit up straighter. Why? Because I thought you might want to buy it. The suggestion caught me completely off guard. The Queen Anne house? Why would you think that? A complicated expression crossed his features, part embarrassment, part determination. Because of what you said at the lake house, about buying it to keep it in the family, because despite everything, you had memories there too. He clasped his hands together, resting them on his knee. The same is true of the Queen Anne house, isn't it? However imperfect your childhood was there, and I'm beginning to understand just how imperfect it was. It's still part of your history. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. The mansion on Queen Anne Hill had been the physical manifestation of the Chen family mythology. The showcase for my parents' success, the stage for Melissa's achievements, the space where I had always felt slightly out of place. The idea of owning it had never crossed my mind. I don't know what to say, I admitted finally. You don't have to say anything right now, he assured me quickly. It's a business proposition as much as a personal one. The property has appreciated significantly since we purchased it. The location is excellent. The structure is sound. If you wanted to convert it to apartments or office space, the zoning could potentially accommodate that. Classic Robert Chen, framing. An emotional offer in practical terms to make it more palatable. But beneath the business language, I sensed something deeper. An acknowledgement of my connection to the family history, however complicated that connection might be. I appreciate you thinking of me, I said carefully. But I'm not sure it makes sense for Prospective Properties' portfolio. Our focus has been on commercial and mixed-use developments, not single-family renovations. I understand, he said, nodding. And as I said, we have a solid offer already. He hesitated, seeming to struggle with his next words. I wanted you to have the option, before it went to strangers. The echo of my own explanation for purchasing the lake house wasn't lost on me. My father was extending an olive branch in the language he knew best, real estate and business opportunities, but the sentiment behind it felt genuine. Can I think about it? I asked finally. Relief softened his features. Of course. We don't need to respond to the current offer until Friday. Take your time. We shifted to discussing the East Side project, the conversation flowing more easily, now that the uncomfortable proposition had been tabled. When he left 30 minutes later, I remained at my desk, contemplating the unexpected offer. The Queen Anne house, my childhood home, the site of 1,000 small heartbreaks and quiet determinations. Did I want to own it? To transform it into something new, or to preserve it as a monument to the Chen family legacy, a legacy I was only now being recognized as part of. My phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. Lunch today? I need to run some marketing concepts for the East Side project. By you. I agreed to meet her at a noodle shop halfway between our offices, appreciating how our professional collaboration had created natural opportunities for the personal relationship we'd never quite managed to build in childhood. As the youngest, partner at her marketing firm, Melissa brought valuable expertise to our joint venture, and I'd found myself genuinely enjoying our creative exchanges. An hour later, I watched my sister navigate the crowded restaurant, her confident stride parting the lunchtime crowd automatically. She'd softened her corporate look slightly in recent months, trading her signature power suits for more creative ensembles that better reflected her personal aesthetic. Today she wore wide-legged trousers with a structured silk top, her hair pulled back in a simple chignon. Sorry I'm late, she said, sliding into the booth opposite me. Client meeting ran over. No problem, I assured her. I ordered you. the spicy miso ramen. Still your favorite? She looked momentarily surprised. You remembered. I shrugged. Some details stick, even through all the complicated history. A small smile touched her lips. Speaking of complicated history, Dad texted me. He told you about the Queen Anne house offer? Just came from his office, actually, I confirmed. I didn't realize you knew about it. I helped them stage it. For the listing photos, she explained. My friend Tara is their real estate agent. She called yesterday about the offer. It's a good one. That's what Dad said. I studied her carefully. How do you feel about them selling it? She considered the question, stirring her water with the metal straw she'd brought from her office. A small environmental gesture that would have seemed performative months ago, but now felt authentic. Mixed emotions, honestly. That house was where I had my first real successes, but also where I started to understand how differently we were treated. Our ramen arrived, temporarily pausing the conversation. Steam rose from the rich broth, carrying the aromas of miso and chili oil. Are you going to buy it? Melissa asked after the server had departed. I don't know, I admitted. It's not the type of property Perspective typically acquires. But? She prompted, always perceptive about my hesitations. But there's something compelling about the idea. Not for business reasons, obviously. For closure? She suggested. I considered this. Maybe. Or maybe for transformation. Taking a space that represented one chapter of my life and reimagining it for a new purpose. Like you did with the lake house, she observed. The lake house was different, I pointed out. I bought it to keep it in the family, not to reinvent it. And now you're thinking about reinventing the family home. She took a thoughtful sip of broth. There's poetry in that. I laughed softly. I wasn't aware you had a poetic streak, Mel. There's a lot we're still learning about each other, she replied, her tone light but meaningful. We spent the rest of lunch discussing the marketing campaign for the East Side project, but the conversation about the Queen Anne house lingered in my thoughts. By the time I returned to my office, a plan was beginning to take shape in my mind. Not quite fully formed, but intriguing enough to pursue. That evening, I drove to Queen Anne Hill for the first time in months. The family home stood on the corner of a tree-lined street, its elegant craftsman architecture distinguished by a deep front porch and decorative woodwork that had been meticulously maintained throughout my parents' ownership. Golden light spilled from the windows, creating the impression of warmth and welcome that the house had always projected to the outside world, regardless of the complicated dynamics that unfolded within. I parked across the street, observing the property with a developer's eye rather than a daughter's. The lot was generous by urban standards, with mature landscaping that added significant value. The structure itself appeared sound from the exterior, though I knew from childhood that the plumbing and electrical systems had required regular maintenance. Zoning in this neighborhood would restrict certain types of conversions, but there were still multiple possibilities for repurposing the space. A figure appeared at the front window. My mother, pulling the curtains closed for the evening. She paused, gazing out into the darkness, and for a moment I thought she might have spotted me. Then she completed her task and moved away, unaware of my presence. I drove home to my townhouse in Capitol Hill, my thoughts swirling with possibilities. The Queen Anne house represented so much of my past, both the painful aspects I'd worked to overcome and the foundation that had, despite everything, shaped me into the woman I'd become. Could owning it help transform those memories into something constructive rather than constraining? The following morning, I called a meeting with my executive team, the core group of professionals who had helped build Perspective properties from concept to reality. I presented them with an unconventional proposal, acquiring the Queen Anne property not as a standard company investment, but as the future headquarters for the Perspective Foundation. The what? Asked Michael, my development director voicing, the confusion visible on several faces around the conference table. The Perspective Foundation, I repeated. A nonprofit arm of our company focused on architectural education for underserved youth, mentorship programs for women in design and construction, and community-based urban planning initiatives. This is the first I'm hearing about a foundation, noted Priya, our chief financial officer. Is this something you've been developing privately? It's a concept I've been considering for some time, I admitted. But the availability of the Queen Anne property has accelerated my timeline. The house has the space and character to serve as both an administrative headquarters and an educational center. The garden could host community workshops and design demonstrations. And this is your childhood home? Clarified Jason, our head of legal affairs, always focusing on the potential complications. Yes, I confirmed, understanding his concern. Which is why I wanted to discuss it with all of you before proceeding. I recognize that there are personal factors influencing this decision. If you believe it's not in the company's best interest, I'm prepared to step back from the idea. A thoughtful silence fell over the room as my team, the professionals whose judgment I had come to trust implicitly, considered the proposition. Financially, we could structure it as a separate entity with its own funding stream, Priya said finally. Tax benefits would be significant, and having a formal community outreach arm could enhance our standing with municipal approval boards for future projects. The personal connection could actually be beneficial for fundraising and publicity, added Layla, our marketing director. The narrative of transforming your childhood home into a space that empowers others has powerful resonance. From a legal perspective, as long as we maintain proper corporate separation and transparent governance, I don't see major obstacles, Jason contributed. Though we'd want to establish a clear charter and independent board to avoid any appearance of self-dealing. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, my team methodically analyzing the proposal from every angle, practical, financial, ethical. By the time we concluded, what had begun as a vague concept had evolved into a concrete plan with defined parameters and clear next steps. So we're doing this? I asked, looking around at the team that had helped build my vision from the ground up. We're doing this, Michael confirmed, a smile spreading across his typically serious features. The Perspective Foundation. I like how it sounds. That afternoon, I called my father and asked to meet him and my mother at the Queen Anne house that evening. Their surprise was evident even over the phone, but they agreed readily. As I drove through the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood, I felt a strange mixture of emotions, nostalgia tinged with lingering pain, but also a new sense of possibility that hadn't existed during my last visit to this house. The sun was setting as I parked in the driveway, casting long golden light across the front lawn where I had once played hide-and-seek with neighborhood children, always the last one found because I'd discovered the perfect hiding spot beneath the back porch steps. My parents greeted me at the door with curious expressions, clearly wondering about the purpose of this sudden request to meet at the house they were planning to leave. "Would you mind showing me around?" I asked, surprising them further. "It's been a while since I've been here, and I'd like to see the whole place again." "Of course," my mother agreed, exchanging a quick glance with my father. We moved through the rooms together. The formal living room where guests had been entertained, the dining room where countless family dinners had unfolded with their complex undercurrents, the kitchen where my mother had prepared elaborate meals, while I did homework at the counter, careful not to be in the way. Upstairs, we visited each bedroom, including mine, now converted to a home office but still holding traces of the pale blue paint I'd selected when I was 12. Throughout the tour, I asked questions about the house's infrastructure, recent renovations, and maintenance history. My parents answered readily, though their bewilderment at my interest was increasingly apparent. Finally, in the sunroom that overlooked the back garden, always my favorite space in the house, I revealed my purpose. "I'd like to make an offer on the house," I said simply. But not for myself to live in, and not exactly as an investment property either. I outlined my vision for the prospective foundation, watching their expressions shift from confusion to surprise to cautious interest. "You want to turn our home into a nonprofit headquarters?" my mother clarified, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," I confirmed. "A place where young people who might not otherwise have access to design education can learn about architecture, urban planning, and sustainable development. Where women in the industry can find mentorship and support. Where communities can participate in the planning processes that will shape their neighborhoods." "Why this house?" my father asked, though I suspected he already understood. "Because transformation matters," I said quietly. "Taking spaces and experiences that might have been limiting and reimagining them as something that empowers others." I met his gaze directly. "And because despite everything, this house is part of my story. I'd like to write its next chapter." A complex emotion crossed my mother's features, something between pride and regret, recognition and nostalgia. "You always saw things differently," she said softly. "Even as a child, looking at spaces and imagining what they could become." "I remember your drawings," my father added unexpectedly. "Sketches of tree houses and secret gardens, buildings with windows in unexpected places." He looked around the sunroom as if seeing it through new eyes. I didn't understand then what I was seeing. "And now?" I prompted gently. "Now I think, I'm beginning to," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "This foundation, it would be your vision, not ours." "Yes," I acknowledged. "But it would still be part of the Chen legacy. Just a different aspect of it than you might have imagined." My mother moved to the windows, gazing out at the garden she had tended so carefully for decades. "What would happen to the gardens?" she asked practically. "They'd be preserved and enhanced," I assured her, "perhaps expanded to include demonstration areas for sustainable landscaping techniques. They could be a teaching tool as well as a beautiful space." She nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like that." "What about the current offer on the house?" my father asked, ever the businessman. "I'll match it," I said simply. "This isn't about negotiating a better deal. It's about purpose." A silence fell between us, not the tense, heavy silence of past misunderstandings, but a thoughtful quiet filled with consideration and perhaps a new kind of recognition. "I think we should discuss the details," my father said finally, in the tone he reserved, "for serious business conversations. If you're making a formal offer, we should approach this professionally." "Of course," I agreed, understanding that for him, treating this as a business transaction provided necessary structure for an emotionally complex situation. We moved to the dining room, where my father retrieved a legal pad from his briefcase and began outlining terms and conditions with methodical precision. My mother excused herself briefly, returning with a tray of tea and cookies, an uncharacteristically domestic gesture for a woman who had always kept her elegant distance. As we discussed closing dates and contingencies, property inspections, and financing arrangements, I felt a subtle but profound shift in our family dynamic. Here we were, seated at the dining table where I had endured countless uncomfortable meals, now engaged in a conversation of equals. My professional expertise acknowledged, my vision taken seriously, my place in the family business landscape finally secured. 2 hours later, we had the framework of an agreement. My father would have his attorney draft the formal documents the following day, and barring any unexpected complications, the Queen Anne house would officially change hands within the month. Not to strangers as they had feared, but to a new entity born from the complex intersection of our shared past and my independent future. As I prepared to leave, my mother walked me to the front door, lingering in a way that suggested she had more to say. "This foundation," she began hesitantly, "would there be any role for me in it?" The question caught me by surprise. "What kind of role are you thinking of?" She gestured vaguely. "I'm not sure. I don't have your business acumen or Melissa's marketing skills, but I do know about gardens and event planning, and I've served on several charitable boards over the years." I studied her face, the familiar features that had often been arranged in expressions of polite disappointment throughout my childhood, now showing genuine uncertainty. My mother, the consummate planner and organizer, was offering her skills, without any clear directive. It was perhaps the most vulnerable I had ever seen her. "The foundation will need a board of directors," I said carefully. "People with various areas of expertise, including experience with nonprofit governance and community relations. Your background could be valuable in that context." Hope flickered across her features. "I'd like that," she said simply. "To be part of what you're building." In that moment, standing in the entryway of the house that had shaped so much of our complicated relationship, I felt something shift within me. A loosening of old resentments, a cautious openness to new possibilities. My mother wasn't asking to control or direct my vision. She was asking to contribute to it, to connect with it in whatever way might be welcome. "We'll make it happen," I promised, and meant it. The following weeks unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. The purchase agreement for the Queen Anne house was finalized, and planning for the foundation's launch began in earnest. Melissa enthusiastically joined the project, offering her firm's services pro bono for the initial branding and website development. My father, to my surprise, arranged a meeting with several of his most philanthropically minded business associates, securing seed funding for the foundation's first year of operations. And my mother, true to her word, threw herself into the planning process with characteristic thoroughness. She researched successful educational nonprofits, gathered information on board governance best practices, and began sketching plans for how the garden could be adapted for teaching purposes while maintaining its aesthetic appeal. 6 weeks after our initial conversation, we gathered at the Queen Anne house for a small private ceremony before the renovation work would begin. Just the four of us, my parents, Melissa, and me, standing in the sunroom where I had first proposed the foundation concept. "I never imagined this," my father admitted, gazing around the space that would soon be transformed. "When we bought this house 30 years ago, I saw it as a symbol of achievement, of having arrived at a certain level of success." "It was that," I acknowledged, "but symbols can evolve. Their meanings can deepen." "Like the lake house," Melissa observed with a small smile. "From status symbol to family connecting point. And now this house," my mother added, "from family home to community resource." We shared a toast with champagne my father had brought for the occasion, the golden liquid catching the late afternoon light streaming through the windows. In that moment, surrounded by the family that had both shaped and misunderstood me for so long, I felt a sense of completion unlike anything I had experienced before. The Chen family legacy was being rewritten, not erased or rejected, but expanded and enriched. The narratives that had once constrained us were giving way to new stories we were choosing to create together, stories that honored our individual strengths rather than forcing us into predetermined roles. Later, after my parents and Melissa had left, I remained in the sunroom, watching the light shift as evening approached. Soon, construction crews would begin the careful work of adapting this space for its new purpose. Walls would be moved, systems updated, spaces reimagined. But something essential would remain: the bones of the house, the structure that had witnessed both the painful and precious moments of my childhood. In transforming this space, I wasn't erasing its history or my own. I was honoring it, acknowledging its influence while choosing its future direction. Like the lake house before it, the Queen Anne property represented not just a real estate transaction, but a reclamation of space, of narrative, of family connection. As I finally turned to leave, locking the front door behind me, I felt a profound sense of rightness. The girl who had once felt invisible in these rooms had returned as a woman with clear vision, not just for physical spaces, but for the relationships that inhabited them. The daughter who had never quite belonged had found her own way to belong, not by conforming to others' expectations, but by creating spaces where authentic self-expression was valued and cultivated. The house that had once been for real family only would now welcome all who sought to learn, to create, to connect. And in that transformation lay the truest expression of what family could mean. Not exclusion, but expansion. Not limitation, but possibility. I walked down the front steps and across the lawn where I had once played alone, imagining buildings that existed only in my mind. Soon, young people would gather here to give shape to their own visions, guided by mentors who recognized their potential. The Chen family legacy had always been about building. My father's retail empire, my mother's social standing, Melissa's marketing career, and now, my contribution. Spaces that empowered others to build their own futures, to see possibilities where others saw limitations. As I reached my car, I glanced back at the house one last time. In the gathering dusk, its windows reflected the changing light, neither fully day nor fully night, but the beautiful, complex transition between them. Much like my family itself, evolving, reconnecting, finding new ways to see one another and the worlds we had built, both separately and together. I smiled, thinking of the engraved plaque that would soon hang beside the front door. The Perspective Foundation, building futures, transforming spaces. Below it, in smaller letters, a phrase I had chosen with particular care: a Chen family legacy. A fitting tribute to a journey that had begun with exclusion and culminated in expansion. Of vision, of family, of possibility. The house that had once been for real family only would now stand as a testament to what family could truly mean when reimagined with perspective, purpose, and the courage to transform limitation into opportunity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.